In the 21st century, Auckland has undergone an exciting transformation of its rail network, with the opening of Britomart and electrification of its network, among other improvements, has seen public transport patronage triple from 33 million in 1995 to over 100 million in 2019, with the transformational city rail link expected to aid further growth. Wellington meanwhile has a solid suburban network, entrenching its northern suburbs, with a total of over 11 million passengers annually. In the rest of the country, however, it's a completely different story, as stations sit abandoned and tracks keep degrading. But it wasn't always this way. New Zealand once had a very extensive rail network that connected most towns and cities 80 years ago, and as recently as 2000, there were still multiple intercity routes operating throughout the country. So how did New Zealand's regional rail network decline to the state it's in today? How big was the network at its peak? What are the consequences of its decline? And so we invest in the network once more. All of these questions will be answered in this video. Before I continue, if you enjoy urbanism and transport content in New Zealand and you want to see more videos like this, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future videos. In the 19th century, rail was the main form of transportation around the world, with countries in Europe and America connecting their villages and cities via trains. New Zealand would follow this trend in 1863, as the first steam railway was built in Christchurch, connecting Wellington to the Wellington town. This would be followed by trains opening in the North Island a decade later, connecting the ports of Auckland and Onehunga, which today serves as the Onehunga line. The expansion would continue for the rest of the 19th century, as rail lines would be built on both the North and South Island, following a call from then Prime Minister Julius Vogel to build railways for economic development. This would result in the 378km Christchurch to Dunedin Railway opening in 1878, and 1900km of railways opening 2 years later across the country. And in 1908, the main North Island trunk line, connecting Auckland and Wellington, would open, thus linking many small North Island towns to the capital and largest city in the country. By 1920, rail was the premier form of transport in New Zealand, with 12 million people all across the country travelling by train that same year. While within cities, people used the extensive train networks that were found in Auckland, Christchurch, and even small cities like Whanganui. Rail was so popular that Sir Edmund Hillary, arguably the most well-known New Zealander, spent over 3 hours on the train each day, travelling to school in Auckland from Tukanu, just south of Auckland, in the 1930s. That same decade, however, multiple rail projects would be cancelled due to the economic fallout of the Great Depression, including the first of the underground tunnels in Auckland CBD, which I talked about in my video on how it took a century for the CRL to be built, as well as the planned extension to Taupo, which is one of the biggest towns without a rail connection today. While New Zealand's rail network then served areas including the aforementioned Taupo and West Coast areas in the 1940s, patronage was still high at over 13 million, with people travelling between small towns and cities like in the case of Sir Edmund Hillary. This was about to change, however, as coming out of World War II, New Zealand was about to dramatically shake up its transport network. After the end of World War II, priorities shifted from building the transport network around rails to roads, the narrative being that cars was the future of transport at the time. This would see the previously well-used tram networks in cities across New Zealand close in the coming decades, and new suburbs on Auckland's North Shore and East Auckland built without rail connection. This would see many railway branches across New Zealand closed in the 1950s and 60s, as the steam train era came to an end, with the country opting to connect towns and cities by roads instead of upgrading the existing rail infrastructure. In the 1970s, the decline of rail in New Zealand would continue, as urban rail networks in Christchurch and Dunedin would cease operations, a fate that was almost a reality in Auckland. While across the country, despite the opening of the Kaimai Tunnel improving connections between Tauranga and Auckland in 1978, rail patronage continued to fall, dropping to 16 million in 1980, a fall from 25 million just 15 years earlier, thus leading to more branches across the country being closed. In 1993, New Zealand's rail network was privatised, which saw even more neglect of services and maintenance on the network, which led to even more falls in patronage, dropping to only 11 million in 1998. For those unaware, privatisation of public transport generally doesn't work because of higher fares and cuts to services. If you want to learn more, City Moose has made a video on this topic, which I've linked in the description. By 2000, New Zealand only had a handful of intercity train routes operating in the country. However, these routes were on its last years and would be gone a few years later, with services connecting Tauranga, Rotorua and Hamilton Auckland closing in 2001, as well as the Bay Express between Wellington and Napier the same year, both of which were due to low passenger numbers and flying and driving being preferred. However, this came down to the lack of investment and privatisation of rail in New Zealand, which left these services slow, expensive and infrequent, thus forcing people into other modes. The Southerner between Invercargill and Christchurch would also close the following year, and unfortunately, the Auckland and Wellington sleeper train, Northerner, would fall in 2004, leaving the capital connection between Wellington and Palmerston North and the overlander between Wellington and Auckland as the only intercity train route in the country by the end of the decade. And only in the space of a few decades, New Zealand had gone from a well-used regional rail network to one that had become abandoned and neglected, with over 2,000 stations across the country closing between 1950 and 2010. This decline, once considered unprecedented, had occurred due to successive government favouring the country's road network instead of upgrading train infrastructure following the steam era, thus degrading services in a vicious cycle, leading to their removal. Fortunately, this would be the lowest point of regional rail, as things would start to improve over the following 20 years, albeit slowly. In 2008, the New Zealand government would renationalise the rail lines under a new state enterprise, Kiwi Rail, which saw rail brought back under public control. However, this wouldn't see much change in passenger rail for the next decade, with the only change to regional rail in that decade being the Overlander, a daytime passenger service between Auckland and Wellington, being replaced by the Northern Explorer, an unsubsidised tourist route. However, the possibility of regional rail returning to the country remained, and in 2021, the first step was taken, as Te Huia, an intercity service between Auckland and Hamilton, began operating on the 5-year trial. Te Huia has surpassed expectations on passenger numbers, with a total of 86,000 passengers in 2024. I'll talk more about Te Huia in a future video, so be sure to subscribe if that interests you. While Te Huia is a step in the right direction towards reinstating a regional rail network, the network is a shell of what it once was. Many people, particularly young people, having no idea that regional rail network travel was once a regular occurrence in New Zealand. So what consequences has this decision to neglect rail in the country led to? The decision to shift New Zealand's transport network towards one that focuses on roads over rail has made its regional rail network a shell of its past self. With the close of hundreds of train stations across both islands, and only 6 long-distance passenger rail services operating today, half of which are unsubsidised tourist routes, with anyone unable to use these modes having poor access to education, jobs and other opportunities. Around 1 in 6 New Zealanders are disabled, which accounts for around 900,000 people, roughly half the size of Auckland. The lack of transport choices in the regions has also made New Zealand's transport network less resilient, and increasing congestion, air and noise pollution, among other costs. As you probably know already, cars and planes are both environmentally unfriendly modes of transport, as the medium petrol car and domestic flight produce carbon emissions of 191 and 255 grams per kilometre. A train in contrast only produces 41 grams of kilometres. A train in contrast only produces 41 grams of CO2 emissions per kilometre, thus making it very environmentally friendly, with trains also offering the chance to get work done or relax, something you can't do while driving. While there's limited intercity rail travel today, there's still intercity bus services connecting different cities and towns in New Zealand, so it is possible to move between towns and cities in New Zealand without having to drive or fly. But while it's good that an option exists for those who can't fly or drive to travel between cities and towns in New Zealand, trains have far more advantages than buses for regional travel, which I'll explain in the next segment. According to research done by transport planner Nicholas Reed, 86% of New Zealanders live within 15 minutes of a current or former train station, which might surprise many of you watching this video. But as I stated earlier, many of New Zealand's biggest towns were once served by rail, with the once bustling stations today likely being deserted in the wheat. But if there was to be investment into making regional rail operational across the country, what benefits would it bring? Rail would be an affordable way to travel between cities and New Zealand, as airfares, particularly in recent years, have gotten increasingly expensive in the country. And on the topic of flying, there's also the fact that there's many people out there who can't fly for medical reasons, or would prefer not to deal with the general airport stress or the fear of flying. Environmentally conscious people would also choose to travel by rail to lower their carbon footprint, while at the same time reducing congestion and wear and tear on roads, the latter of which New Zealand spends a significant amount of money on each year, as I've already mentioned. Rail also has a significant economic impact, as despite a small network, generates $3.3 billion from the New Zealand economy annually. So by connecting small towns in the Waikato to large population centres of Auckland, Hamilton and Tauranga, for example, would increase access to jobs and education in major centres, while also allowing for tourists to visit these small towns. I did state earlier that there are interregional buses operating between New Zealand towns and cities, which at least provides an option for intercity travel which isn't by car or plane. However, interregional buses have the disadvantage of not having its dedicated space, no toilets on board, being less friendly for disabled people, and generally being less comfortable, all of which can have the advantage here. This doesn't make buses for regional transport bad, but I think that rail should be the background of intercity transport networks, with buses serving parts of the country that have low populations and or no rail line. Greater Auckland, a group advocating for public transport improvement in Auckland, released Regional Rapid Rail, a plan to connect Auckland to other North Island towns and cities back in 2017. While costs and other info might be outdated, it is still just as relevant today. I've left a link to the 60-page document in the description if you're interested in learning more about the proposal. While regional rail has a lot of benefits to New Zealand, the lack of investment and maintenance in the network has created multiple challenges to rejuvenate the once thriving rail network, both from the costs and implementing rails. But what are the challenges and how big are they? The first challenge is pretty obvious. As I just stated, the lack of investment in rail led many rail lines to degrade in recent decades, while over 2,000 stations across the country have shut down and stood abandoned. Thus, upgrading stations and reopening the line to serve rail would require significant investment, with Te Huia costing $19 million to set up, which might sound like a lot, but it's very small compared to the $2 billion Waikato Expressway that opened around the same time. Capacity is another issue affecting regional rail viability, as large sections of the network, outside of a North Island trunk line, aren't double-tracked and lack passing width. This is an issue because any regional services would share tracks with freight services, thus limiting the frequency of trains, while the speed of trains is slow due to mountainous terrain in multiple parts of the country. With a table from Dr. Andre Brett, who's done a lot of research into regional rail in New Zealand and made a book on it titled Can't Get From Here to There, showing that existing while the speed of the trains are slow due to not only the mountainous terrain in multiple parts of the country, but also the lack of investment in the network. Dr. Andre Brett, who's done a lot of research into regional rail in New Zealand and made a book on it titled Can't Get From Here to There, made a table showing that existing/historical long-distance services have average speeds of 50 to 70 km per hour, slower than driving. Frequency and speed are important to getting people to use the train, as if the gap between trains is too long or it takes too slow compared to driving, they'll drive instead. Dr. Brett's book is very comprehensive and looks more into how New Zealand's regional rail network declined from the lack of investment. I left a link to the book in the description if you're interested in reading it yourself. And speaking of trains, appropriate rolling stock needs to be provided. There are a few older diesel trains that were used in Auckland until 2014 that are currently being stored, but they have been refurbished for Te Huia and Capital Connection. There's also the option of using electric trains in some routes, such as Auckland to Wellington and Auckland to Tauranga, should parts of the routes become electrified. Or tilt trains, which allow the train to travel faster around corners than most trains, and are used in Queensland and Japan, the former of which has the same narrow gauge as New Zealand. Making these improvements would cost upwards of billions of dollars due to the lack of investment in the network, as well as operating the services, as Te Huia costs $5 million to operate annually. Though as I stated earlier, this is far cheaper than building and maintaining new and existing highways, which also increase carbon emissions and are inaccessible to those who can't drive. It's not just the improved infrastructure that's a challenge to improving regional rail, there's also regulatory challenges. Currently, Kiwi Rail, a state-owned enterprise, owns the rail lines and stations across the country, so any plans to in-state routes would require a business case, as well as funding from central and local government. Te Huia took 3.5 years to get it up and running, although its starting date was delayed due to COVID and upgrading the tracks around Papakura. Finally, there's the perception of some New Zealanders who argue that New Zealand doesn't have the population, it's too expensive, the country is too mountainous to have regional rail. But while some of these points are true, this didn't stop the country from having a very extensive network before World War II, and only fell into decline following the decision to prioritise the state highway network instead of upgrading the routes. And it's not like regional rail is some very niche thing, as it's very regular in European countries and fellow Anglophone nations like Australia and the UK. New Zealand once had a very strong regional rail network connecting most of the country in the first half of the 20th century.
However, the lack of investment and prioritising road transport following the Second World War led to the closure of stations and services ceasing around the country, resulting in most intercity travel in New Zealand today being by either car or plane. However, as Te Huia shows, there is still interest in regional rail, and people will use the service if it's frequent and reliable, but it's worth going further and investing in rail upgrades and services in other parts of the country.
In my opinion, New Zealand's a push forward to reinstating the national regional rail network, as it provides a low carbon, accessible way to travel around the country without the stress of driving or flying, and enables access to services and education for those unable to drive. This won't come cheaply, as the lack of investment in recent decades leaves a lot more line upgrades to be done. However, it will only get expensive to invest later. It's really sad how New Zealand's regional rail network was left to decline in the second half of the 20th century, with many young people not knowing the country once had this extensive regional rail network that people used all over. However, there has been talk of reinstating a regional rail network as well in the last few months, so there is hope that one day we'll see more people travelling regionally by train, because as Te Huia shows, if people will use regional rail, if it's affordable and reliable compared to driving.
Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, consider liking and subscribing to see more videos like this. What do you think? Should New Zealand reinvest in its regional rail network? And if so, which routes should be prioritised? Let me know in the comments down below. And as always, I'm Sam, aka Kiwi Planner, and I'll see you in the next video.